Seats, we're going to get started. Good evening. I'm Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology here at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'm also Director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, one of the hosts for this evening's event, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special program featuring Chuck Collins and Sam Pizzigati, authors of the two new books on inequality that will be featured this evening. So welcome to those of you in the audience, and welcome to our viewers joining via the live stream. Let me tell you just a little bit about CUNY and the Graduate Center for any of you who are new guests here. In my view, and in that of many of my colleagues, CUNY is an especially appropriate venue to spend an evening discussing inequality. CUNY, the public university of the city of New York, is the country's largest urban public university and the third largest university system in the United States. We have 25 campuses, about 275,000 matriculated students, and nearly 7,000 professors. CUNY itself is a massive project aimed at reducing socioeconomic inequality and enabling intergenerational mobility. When our first college, the City College of New York, was founded in 1847, it was described as an experiment whose purpose was to educate the children of the whole people. And 170 years later, that mission is intact. Today, about 40% of our undergraduates come from households with income below $20,000 a year, and over 40% are first-generation college goers. As I'm sure many of you heard, a recent study by the economist Raj Chetty and his team identified the 10 colleges in the United States that produce the most upward economic mobility for their students, and 6 of those 10 are CUNY colleges. CUNY, with a design unique in the United States. Absolutely. We were extremely proud when that study was released. And CUNY, with a design unique in the United States, has dedicated one of its campuses solely to graduate study, and that is the Graduate Center, where we are this evening. The Graduate Center, a small school embedded in this large system, enrolls nearly 5,000 graduate students across an array of disciplines. The Graduate Center is committed to CUNY's historic mission, and we provide access to doctoral education for diverse groups of talented students, including those who have been underrepresented in higher education. And our PhD students are crucial contributors to the CUNY system. While they pursue their own studies, they teach and train over 200,000 CUNY undergraduates every year. The Graduate Center has long been a venue for teaching, research, and public exchanges related to multiple facets of inequality. And in the last decade, the Graduate Center has set among its highest priorities expanding our capacity in research and teaching in the field of socioeconomic inequality, with an emphasis on empirical work, high-quality data, and quantitative methods. The Graduate Center has worked toward that goal by investing in new faculty, expanding opportunities for visiting scholars, developing specialized courses, new master's program, and also providing a platform for public programming and debate. One of our primary goals is to contribute to and to deepen this complicated national and international conversation about economic inequality that has received so much attention in recent years. The Graduate Center is home to more than 30 centers and institutes focused on applied and theoretical research, including our own, the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. The Stone Center's mission is to build and disseminate knowledge related to the causes and the nature and the consequences of multiple forms of socioeconomic inequality. I'm happy to say that in addition to me, 3 other Stone Center core faculty are here this evening: Salvatore Morelli and Paul Krugman and Leslie McCall. The other 2, Miles Korak and Branko Milanovic, have been lost to travels. They're pulled away. But in any case, I hope you'll get a chance to meet several of us at the reception, which I'll say something about in a few minutes. So let me give you a preview of plans and logistics for the evening. After this introduction, which will last a little less than 10 minutes, Chuck and Sam will take to the podium, and they're going to present highlights from the 2 books. That will take us until about 7 o'clock. And then from 7 to 7:30, I'm going to sit down and talk with them about both books, raising a series of intertwined questions. From 7:30 to 7:45, we're going to take questions from the audience. We're eager to hear from you. Jimmy Cook from our public programming office here will respond to raised hands by your side with a microphone. We'll close that at 7:45 sharp, and immediately following that, we're going to have a reception in this room, and we invite all of you here to stay for a glass of wine, and of course to stop at the book table and buy both books. In order to make that even more interesting, Chuck and Sam are going to sit and sign the books and chat with you. To those of you in the live stream audience, I'm sorry we can't offer you a glass of wine, but we do invite you to go online to Polity Press or elsewhere and to buy the books. And let me note that soon a video of this evening's events will go on the Graduate Center website, and we'll use social media to announce when that's ready. Finally, please silence your cell phones. Okay, and now a little bit of substance, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. Our overarching topic for this evening is economic inequality. There is an enormous amount to be said about inequality, but I'm going to limit myself to 4 general points, the purpose of which is simply to set some context. As we listen to this evening's presentation, we should remember a few basic realities. First, economic inequality in the United States has risen sharply since the 1980s. Inequality has risen with respect to earnings and household income and wealth. Second, in many other countries, especially other rich countries, inequality has also risen during this period. However, compared to other countries in general, the increases seen in the United States have been steeper, and the current levels of inequality are higher. Third, compared with other affluent countries, when we look at income inequality across American working-age households today, we see that inequality of market income, mainly earnings, is very high, and that crucially, redistribution is limited. It's modest. In other words, the United States does less than many other countries in the use of tax and transfer policies to mitigate the comparatively high levels of income inequality that are created by the market. And fourth and finally, a large research literature has established that national institutions matter, and they matter a lot. There are indeed sweeping transnational factors at work, but an overwhelming body of evidence has established that within country public policies can and do reduce disparities in market income and also in the inequality in household income after tax and transfer policies have been taken into account. This evening, you're going to hear about an array of policies as Chuck and Sam walk us through some of the key arguments, an array of these policies, as Chuck and Sam walk us through some of the key arguments in their 2 interesting and really delightfully readable books. The 2 books that we're featuring this evening. This is Chuck's book, Is Inequality in America Irreversible, and Sam's book, The Case for a Maximum Wage. So let me just say a couple of things about our speakers. We're really very delighted to have them both here. Chuck Collins is a scholar and a campaigner based at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. At IPS, he directs the Program on Inequality and the Common Good, which partners with advocacy groups to promote philanthropic reform, state and federal tax fairness, and other policy reforms aimed at reducing inequality. He's also co-editor of the website inequality.org, an invaluable resource for scholars and activists alike. A decade ago, Chuck co-founded Wealth for the Common Good, a network of mainly business leaders and high-income households who joined forces to promote shared prosperity and fair taxation. In 2015, Wealth for the Common Good merged with the organization Patriotic Millionaires, and we're delighted to have members of the Patriotic Millionaires in the audience this evening. Chuck is the author of many books and articles, with much of his work focused on making the case for more vigorous taxation of inherited fortunes. Recently, he wrote Born on Third Base, right here, a 1%er makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. Born on Third Base, which was published in 2016, is an excellent read, combining memoir, inequality research, policy analysis, and an electrifying call to action. Sam Pizzigati is an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and with Chuck, he co-edits inequality.org. A veteran labor journalist, Sam spent 20 years directing the publishing operation of the United States' largest trade union, the 3 million plus member National Education Association, and Sam has also written extensively on economic inequality with articles and op-eds appearing worldwide. He's authored and edited several books as well. His 2004 book, Greed and Good, Understanding and Overcoming the Inequality That Limits Our Lives, was named an outstanding title from the American Library Association. And his 2012 book, which I highly recommend. The Rich Don't Always Win, The Forgotten Triumph Over Plutocracy that created the American middle class 1900 to 1970, traces the dismantling of America's original Gilded Age. Chuck and Sam, in short, are both remarkable and influential scholar activists, and please join me in welcoming them this evening. And I turn it over to Chuck.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Janet and the Stone Center. But thank you, Janet, for your decades of scholarship on these issues of inequality and the programming of the Stone Center. If you're here for the first time, you should know they do several events like this a month or sometimes a week. So sign up and learn about what they're doing. And as Janet sort of implied, I wrote a book called Born on Third Base. So part of the perspective I bring to these issues of inequality is actually having grown up in the 1%. My great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer. So my dad used to say bringing home the bacon meant something different in our family. And I think Sam and R's assumption is that you're here not because you want to hear another hour of discussion about the picture, the data, the extreme inequalities we're living in. We're kind of assuming you're here to engage around solutions, and the books that we wrote, which are mercifully short, are very much focused on that way. But if I was to be asked, if I had 1 minute to give you 3 facts that sort of underscore the level of extreme inequality of income, wealth, and opportunity we're facing today, here they are. The richest 400 people in the United States now have as much combined wealth as the bottom 64% of households. The richest 3 people, Bezos, Buffett, and Gates, have as much combined wealth as the bottom half of U.S. households combined. How is that possible? Because over the last several decades, the ranks of what I call underwater nation have increased. That the number of households with 0 or negative net worth in the last 25 years increased from 15% to 21%. And if you want to understand the racial wealth divide, 37% of African American households have 0 or negative net worth, 33% of Latino households. So that's the context. We've lived through 40 years of wage stagnation. The gap has continued to grow. By the way, I'm not a PowerPoint person, so I try not to let it get me off track too much, but here. So why does this matter? And again, we're assuming that you are here because you understand how these extreme inequalities are corrosive, how they undermine the health of our democratic society, how they undermine the social compact and trust between people. How do we know that? There's now a mountain of research, of books that have really come out in the last decade that have really helped us understand all the ways these inequalities undermine everything we care about. Democracy, civic life, and the quality of life. And actually, Sam and I both hosted Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who a decade ago wrote a book called The Spirit Level, which looks at how more equitable societies do better on all kinds of health indicators. And their new book is called The Inner Level, which looks at how these extreme inequalities undermine our inner sense of well-being and our psychological sense of well-being. So I think that there's ample evidence that these inequalities matter, not just poverty, but the gap, the distortion and that's caused by extreme inequality. So how do we do this? And one of the things I've noticed in the conversation about inequality, and I think you'll see it now in the wider public sphere, is people have different diagnoses, if you will. Why is inequality growing? If you have a diagnosis, if your explanation is that inequality is a reflection of lack of educational opportunity or technological change, then your remedy is to fix people, prepare people, invest in education and technological literacy and education to lift up and address inequality. But if you believe that inequality is a reflection of power imbalances, that the rules of the economy have been tipped to benefit asset owners at the expense of wage earners, then you have a different diagnosis and you have a different set of remedies. And if I were pressed to put on a bumper sticker, which you should never do, your analysis of your explanation for the drivers of these extreme inequalities, I would go back to a book title that I loved from a couple years ago. Here it is, The Judas Economy, The Triumph of Capital and the Betrayal of Work. That the economy, the rules of the economy have been tipped to benefit wealth at the expense of wage earners. Trade policy, tax policy, wage policy, government spending and regulation, on down the line. So can we reverse these extreme inequalities? The title of the book I wrote asks that question. The answer is maybe. It's kind of in our hands. I have a lot of good news, but one of the things that I would just say is that the solutions that are being put forward to reduce inequality, raising the minimum wage, reducing college debt, asking and designing tax policies to ensure the very top pay their fair share, those policies are wildly popular. And generationally, the younger the voters, the more popular they are. So that bodes well for a realignment, a political and social and cultural realignment to address these decades of extreme inequality. So here's my thinking on the way forward. We need campaigns that are, I call them game-changing. What do I mean by that? A game-changing campaign actually addresses the concentrations of wealth and power, reduces the concentration of wealth and power that is corroding the democracy in our society. They also generate revenue or create resources that can be invested in creating opportunity. They come with a constituency that's willing to engage and fight to advocate for those policies and defend them. And they change the narrative, they change the stories that hold inequality in place. And I'm going to give you three quick examples, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who has a really big idea. Here I am with some students from the San Jose State University. They are part of a statewide coalition called the California College for All. Their big idea is to create low-cost or free, tuition-free higher education in California at public universities, essentially bring back the glory days of California's state education system. They propose to pay for that by restoring a tax, an inheritance tax, an estate tax that went away in California in 2005. An estate tax that would be on households with $10 million and up, that would generate some $4 billion a year that would assist 2.2 million students reduce their tuition or attend free college. They have momentum. This is a game-changing campaign because it addresses that concentration of wealth. It generates resources for free college. It comes with a constituency, students and their parents, and it changes the story. One of the ways they're changing the story is the students are going out and recruiting people from the 60s and 70s that got free college to stand up next to them and say, it was a great investment in me. Why can't we do it for the next generation? Another point, another game-changing campaign. As you New Yorkers know, There is a huge amount of global capital flowing into coastal cities, driving up the cost of real estate. Those buildings that are being constructed around the city, some of them are luxury properties that people are occupying, but for the most part, they are what I would call wealth storage units. They're just a new form of asset class. And in Boston, we did a study that found, 2/3 of the 2,000 units, luxury housing units that have been built in the last 8 years are absentee-owned. They're not occupied by people. They might be, they're not taking a residential exemption. 1/3 of them are owned by shell corporations that mask their beneficial owners. So, what's happening in all these cities? In Boston, people are organizing to levy a luxury real estate tax to generate revenue to create permanently affordable housing in the city of Boston. They're inspired by San Francisco, that's already instituted a luxury real estate tax, a vacancy tax. New York is looking at this pied-à-terre tax. People are looking at how do you address the distortion caused by huge amounts of global wealth that is looking for investments outside the market, and trying to tax that wealth as it touches down in a place, in a city, in a housing market, and capture those funds for affordable housing. And that's a movement that I'm seeing all over the country, mostly in the coastal cities, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. Another idea, luxury jets. A couple thousand of them, about 10,000 private luxury jets. We effectively subsidize them. Why not impose essentially a luxury consumption tax on private jets, dedicating the money to whatever we call it, the Green New Deal, green jobs, green infrastructure. Again, we're addressing a consumption that's profligate and against the interests of the society, putting a cost on it, increasing the cost, putting that revenue into offsetting and creating the solution. Those are just what I would call game-changing campaigns, and there's lots more examples of that, and some of you are probably part of those kind of campaigns. Let me turn it over to Sam, who's going to talk about another big game-changing idea.
Thank you, Chuck. Let's talk about this other idea, an idea that some people at first take might think is a rather meshuggah idea, but let's talk about it. The idea of campaigning for a maximum wage. Now, not long ago, serious people, we're not talking about the idea of a maximum wage, a cap on income, not anywhere in the entire world. But that world has changed. In Switzerland, and I hope people can see it on the screen. Okay, I'll talk you through it. In Switzerland in 2013, the Young Socialist Group ran a campaign to cap CEO compensation at 12 times worker pay. That campaign for that referendum was actually polling at near 50% until corporate Switzerland unleashed a last-minute advertising barrage that defeated the measure. In France, in the last presidential election, in the first round, the most progressive candidate in the race campaigned on a platform that included a pitch for a maximum wage. He finished just 4 percentage points behind the eventual winner of that first round of the French presidential election. In the UK, last November, the Labour Party released a report that called for changes in the British companies law that would allow stakeholders in British corporations to impose a cap on executive compensation. In South Africa, last spring, a poll found 55% of South Africans supporting the idea of a cap on executive compensation, with only 18% opposing. In the USA, a year ago, about this time of year, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota, now the Attorney General of Minnesota, said that we need a maximum wage in the United States. And finally, in Australia this past June, 75% of those polled called for a cap on income, a maximum wage. One person who would be very pleased by all of this would be the philosopher Felix Adler. Some people in New York know him as the founder of the Ethical Culture Society. He co-chaired the first national campaign against child labor in the United States. He introduced the idea of free universal kindergarten into the United States, and he was a philosopher at Columbia University for many years. In 1880, Felix Adler became the first American of note to call for a cap on income, a maximum wage. It was covered in the New York Times of that day. And Adler proposed a 100% tax on income starting at the point when a, quote, when a certain high and abundant sum has been reached, amply sufficient for all the comforts and true refinements of life. Such a levy, said Adler, would tax away, and I love this phrase, such a levy would tax away, quote, pomp and pride and power. In other words, don't just tax high income, cap it. And why not? Well, we already recognize that decency demands a floor under earnings, a minimum wage. Shouldn't social decency also demand an income ceiling? A maximum wage, an off-the-wall notion? Well, not to Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1942, April 1942, FDR proposed a 100% tax on income, individual income over $25,000. After taking inflation into account, that would be around $375,000 today. Now, Congress didn't pass Roosevelt's maximum wage, but Congress did set a top marginal tax rate of 94% on income over $200,000. And until the Reagan era, the top marginal tax rate in the United States never dipped below 70%. But there was a basic political dynamic that doomed FDR's stiff, high progressive tax rate on top incomes. America's wealthy, and that dynamic was this. America's wealthy had a direct personal interest in knocking that 94% rate down, knocking the 91% top rate during the Eisenhower years down, knocking the 70% rate of the 1960s and 70s down. They felt this intense direct interest, personal interest in that. Every point they could knock off the top rate could save them tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And this political reality gave tax politics in the United States a basic political asymmetry. That is, the rich felt a direct interest in reducing those top rates, and everybody else just had an indirect interest in sustaining those top rates. And so the rich wanted change much more than everybody else wanted to sustain what they had. So throughout the mid-20th century, we had a political situation where the rich hammered and hammered and hammered on those steep top progressive rates, and eventually they prevailed. And they prevailed through campaigns like this. This is the cover of the U.S. News and World Report in the middle of the 1950s. It's a story about T. Coleman Andrews, who was a Virginian, who was the chief of the IRS, an Eisenhower appointee. He quit the Eisenhower administration, saying the income tax is bad because it was conceived in class hatred, is an instrument of vengeance, and plays right into the hands of the communists. So today's income cappers have learned a lesson from all of this. And that lesson is that if we're going to have a cap on income, it needs to focus on the gap between the top and everyone else, not any specific income figure. Why cap the gap? If we link a cap on pay at the top to pay at the bottom, the income of our richest would only rise if the income of our poorest rose first. If we cap the gap, our richest would have a vested personal interest in helping our poorest. And these poor would have a vested personal interest in keeping that linkage in place. The focus on that gap has already begun. The 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, most important reform legislation that was passed after the economic collapse in 2008. This Dodd-Frank Act requires corporations to annually disclose the ratio between their CEO and median worker compensation. The first disclosures started coming out last year, and what I think has happened is that a new pay ratio era has begun, and we're seeing headlines about that ratio. Walmart's CEO earns 1,188 times as much as the company's median worker. We're seeing headlines like that all across the country. Corporate America sees this new pay ratio era essentially as the end of civilization as we know it. So let's talk civilization. What defines a civilized society? Limits. Limits define a civilized society. Civilized societies set limits to protect and advance the common good. Our modern civilized society sets all sorts of limits. We limit how fast our motorists can drive. We limit how many ducks our hunters can shoot. We limit how much noise our neighbors can make after 10 o'clock at night. We set limits on just about everything except income. We have no limits on how much income an individual can grab. The inevitable result, outrageous rewards give individuals an incentive to behave outrageously, to do whatever is necessary, no matter how socially destructive, to hit the jackpot. What do we get when we have no limits on how much our powerful can grab? We get this. Ex-Massey CEO Blankenship downplayed minor black lung threat. We get this. Fentanyl billionaire comes under fire as death toll mounts from prescriptions opioids. We get this. Sempra CEO gets biggest bonus ever after biggest gas leak ever. We get all sorts of headlines like this. If you look at the Wall Street Journal every day, each edition seems to bring a new raft of corporate scandals. The Dodd-Frank pay ratio mandate, that requirement that corporations disclose their CEO median worker pay ratio, that could help us change all this. With the executive worker pay ratio figures publicly disclosed, we can begin leveraging the power of the public purse against inequality. With pay ratios public knowledge, we can organize to levy higher taxes on firms that compensate their top execs at over 25 or 50 or 100 times what their workers are making. We can organize to direct government subsidies only to businesses that keep executive pay, worker pay gaps modest. We can organize to deny government contracts to firms with executive pay that exceeds a modest multiple of worker pay. 7 states now have legislation to this effect now pending. The latest piece of the state legislation, Washington State House Bill 1778, was introduced at the end of this past January. It imposes a 10% tax surcharge on companies that pay their CEOs at over 50 times the pay of their median workers, and ups that surcharge to 25% on firms with ratios over 150 to 1, and uses the tax proceeds to fund a working family's tax exemption. This new pay ratio politics even has a landmark victory. In Portland, as of 2018, in Oregon, rather, as of 2018, the city of Portland is taxing firms with CEOs making more than 100 and 250 times their median workers at a higher tax rate than other corporations. How much could placing consequences on CEO-worker pay ratios impact our overall level of income inequality? Well, the reality is that if we look at the top 0.1% of income earners in the United States, corporate and banking executives make up the lion's share of those top 0.1% folks. So corporate executives make up over 40%, banking executives almost another 19%, and all the other categories of top 1.1% are just tiny compared to corporate executives. So overall, between 60% and 2/3 of our richest of our rich owe their fortunes to big corporations or big banks. In our emerging new age of pay ratio politics, almost every social situation could become an arena for egalitarian struggle. Students could join with university faculty to demand a modest pay multiple between top administrator salaries and campus worker pay. Donors to nonprofits could insist that the organizations that they support limit their executive pay to a similar modest multiple of worker pay. Workers could take pay ratio demands to the bargaining table. Consumers could wage boycotts against firms with wide CEO worker pay ratios. Pension funds could use pay ratio data to help determine where they invest. This is Denise Napier, the Connecticut State Treasurer, who supports moves in this direction. So the path to an income maximum starts with ratios. Every pay ratio victory won, no matter how small, could help people understand that the level of inequality that surrounds us has been and always will be a human construct. No force of nature leaves some of us enormously richer than others. We can choose to become more equal. Struggles around pay ratios can help make these choices clear. Janet's already referred to some useful background reading on what Chuck and I have been talking about here. We have the new books that are just out this year that we worked at, and there's much, much more at inequality.org, and I hope all of you will have the time to visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck and Sam. Give it a moment. They're going to move the podium so those of you back there can see us. I think I'm going to jump right to some policy wonky questions. How's
Okay.
that? Chuck often describes himself as a storyteller, but I actually know that what he really is a policy wonk. Actually, I think they both are. And I'm just want to turn to two rather specific policy questions, and then as time permits, we'll turn. I have several questions that have to do really with narratives of inequality and the politics as well. But I want to get very specific in public policy. So Chuck, in your work in this book and in several of your earlier books and articles, you focus a lot on taxing wealth. A big discussion, of course, in the news today. And you've talked about strategies for taxing both wealth stocks, property, and also wealth transfers such as inheritance and gifts. Can you give our audience a very short course, a 3-minute course, on the current U.S. approach to taxing wealth? What is working, what's not working, and what needs to be changed?
Okay. Well, aside from property taxation, which is a form of taxing property wealth, you know, since 1916, we've had a federal estate tax, which is a transfer tax only levied on the most wealthy households. In the 1990s, there was a pitch battle to, over whether to abolish it. It still exists. It's sort of been fighting on life support, but today, the estate tax is individuals with 11.4 million, couples with 22.8 million or so, pay a transfer tax at death. That, and there's that even that is, it was almost abolished as part of the Trump tax cut. So that's the sort of the state of the estate tax. There are proposals to make the estate tax stronger. Senator Sanders has a bill that would put a graduated rate, so estates over 50 million or over $1 billion would pay a higher rate than estates under 10 million. So that's that's contested. That's part of, and then I think that the sort of what's new is Senator Warren has this proposal to levy an annual wealth tax that would focus on wealth over 50 million taxed at a 2% rate. I believe wealth over $1 billion the rate would rise to 3%. It would, estimates raise 2.75 trillion over a decade. So that's new terrain. It does have administrative challenges. I mean, there's the annual assessment of what is the valuation of somebody's wealth and assets, particularly privately owned. There's there's a potential constitutional barrier to imposing that. And then there's this larger challenge of just hidden wealth. And this is something that Sam and I work a lot on. We at IPS sort of staff a little, what we call the Hidden Wealth Working Group, which is just trying to understand where the money is going. So even the estate tax revenue has been going down to, on its annual collections. And our theory is that part of what's happening is wealth is vanishing from the ledger. It's going offshore. It's going into trusts. I should also mention there's an active proposal to transition the estate tax, which is a tax on the estate, to an inheritance tax, something that actually taxes the recipients. And there's a thoughtful conversation about how to manage that transition. Certainly politically, it would be more defensible if people understood that this was a tax on the sort of windfall inheritance as opposed to fortunes accumulated over a lifetime. Anyway, so those are a little bit of the terrain, I guess, on wealth tax. Okay,
great. I now want to shift the focus to Sam to talk about this maximum wage, which some of you may have noted from his remarks. He's been shifting back and forth between talking about a maximum wage and maximum income. And those are, especially for those of us in the inequality world, that's very different, obviously. So let me ask you, somewhat as I asked Chuck, to walk the audience through the maximum wage proposal, which is really fascinating. You emphasize, just to kick that off, as you noted in your remarks here, that the ceiling or the cap has to be set using a relative, not an absolute framework. But I think more importantly, in fact, you're actually proposing a cap on household income, not on wages or earnings per se. So tell us how exactly would this maximum policy work? What's the floor? What's the multiplier? What's the ceiling? And why not just talk about a maximum income?
Okay, let me start with that second part first. People understand what a minimum wage is. They understand that without a floor under what people can earn, if you don't have that floor, your society is going to be inviting meanness and exploitation. People understand that. So when we use the phrase maximum wage, we're trying to play off that and get across the idea that if your society doesn't have a ceiling on how much people can grab in a year, you're also going to be inviting meanness and exploitation. So we talk about maximum wage, but we're really, as you note, talking grander than that. We're talking about a cap on income. How could that work? Well, there's the classic formulation, the formulation of Felix Adler that I noted there, the formulation in 1917 of a national campaign that was led by an all-star cast of American progressives. You had Jane Addams, the founder of modern American social work. You had E.W. Scripps, the founder of the Scripps-Howard newspaper chain. You had Sidney Hillman, who was then the hottest labor leader, young labor leader in the United States. And you had Amos Pinchot, who was Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign of 1912. He was the brains behind that campaign. And they called for a 100% tax on income over $100,000 at that time. In the 1930s, you had Huey Long and the Share Our Wealth campaign. They also called for a 100% tax on income over specific figures, which changed during the Great Depression. Then you had Franklin Roosevelt, as I noted, who said that no individual should have single individual should have more than $25,000 after paying that indivial's
Can you walk them through
taxes.
the numbers in your book? You gave a very, very specific plan there.
Well, the numbers would evolve over time, but I would hope that they would evolve to the point where we're talking about a 10 times multiple between the income floor and the income ceiling. That over 10 times a minimum wage, you would be subject to a 100% tax rate.
100 times? I thought the multiplier was 100. And they said,
The multiplier would evolve, hopefully down to 10 times. But I think the key is not so much the specific multiple, whether it's 10 or 25 or whatever. The key is tying the interests of people at the top to the interests of people at the bottom. And that's the most fundamental point.
Okay, thank you. I would encourage you all to read this. I just have to say that for me, working through the numbers, made it make sense. The levels essentially, the minimum wage is about $15,000 a year. 100 times that would be about $1.5 million. So just to get a sense of the levels, this is where, and then we were talking about 100% marginal tax on household income above that. One thing that you have to realize, of course, and you will when you read these books, is we all know that CEO pay is high, but some of the numbers are so extraordinary. I read in their work that the top 25 hedge fund executives, the average annual income is $900 million a year. It's a big number. So a lot of these, what's up on the high end are just extraordinarily high. So I think that has to be held in your hand as you think through these, what these taxes would look like. So why not just go back to the 91% marginal tax rate on labor income that we had during the socialist Eisenhower years?
Yeah, yes. During the socialist Eisenhower years, as you know, we had a 91% top marginal rate. And that rate and the 70% rate that was in effect through the 60s and into the 1970s made a huge difference We went from a society where the top 1% had received 25% of the nation's income just before the Great Depression, to a society in the 1950s and 60s where the top 1% only took in 7% of the nation's income. So that's a tremendous.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I'll try to speak up, sorry. So we went from a society where the richest 1% had 25% of the nation's income to a society where the richest 1% was taking in 7% of the nation's income. That was a great victory for steeply progressive tax rates. But the problem was those steep progressive tax rates could not be sustained. They could not be sustained because the progressive taxes, as traditionally structured, create a political asymmetry. Simply put, as I tried to note before, the rich have more of a vested interest in knocking those top rates down than everybody else has in keeping those top rates up. And that's why I think we need a link between top and bottom.
Let me ask the next question, Chuck. I'm going to direct this to you first. This is to both of you. In your work, in these books, and in much of your earlier work, you both focus a lot of attention on the top of the top. That is, households with the greatest wealth, workers with the highest compensation. There are a lot of reasons to be concerned about the runaway top. We've all heard a great deal in the last 5 years about the top 1% and the top 1% of the top 1%. My question is, with all this focus on the top, aren't we distracting attention from crucial efforts aimed at supporting poor families and protecting the millions of working and middle-class families from the massive growing economic insecurities and risks that these families are facing? I'll editorialize the end of that question. I worry that this obsession with the top has taken our concern and our attention away from the bottom 80.
I mean, I share that concern. I think when we were positioning this work 10 years ago, our experience was people were focused on poverty, solutions to raise the floor, level the playing field, and that what was not on the table was that concentration of wealth and power and how that was affecting everything, how that was distorting. And so I think we programmatically made a decision to sort of focus on that, not to the neglect of, policies that, I'd like to see us move toward, more of a Nordic model where you have this decency floor that Sam said, that both includes, a minimum wage, but access to health care and universal lifelong learning and, the things that actually would address poverty. One thing I've noticed, and this gets into narrative a little bit, but if the focus stays on poverty and not on inequality, then all the remedies, in my experience, are about how do we focus on people who are at the low end? How do we, which are important, but it sort of takes us away from the systemic understanding that we're living through systemic inequalities. We are not going to be able to raise the floor and even have equitable policies in a society that's so distorted by concentrations of wealth and power. So I guess it's not to distract or deflect. In fact, I find the opposite. Oftentimes, people don't want to talk about concentrations of wealth. They'll talk about anything but. And the focus becomes on poverty, and we're going to fix the poor, right? We're going to focus on one framework and one narrative, and that's, to me, a distraction from talking about systemic inequality.
And if you look at the studies that have been done, the comparative national studies, the nations, the societies that have the least rich show much more empathy to people at the bottom of the economic system than countries and nation societies that have incredible concentrations of income and wealth. The London School of Economics this past January just released a major study that brings up to date that research.
All right, let's talk, we have a few minutes before we open up to the audience. Let's talk about the politics and the contemporary politics. I'm going to combine a couple of questions. First of all, has the conversation about inequality changed in the last few months with the shifting political situation in ways that you all find to be important? Do you see any moves taking shape in Congress now that could shift us towards a more equal distribution of earnings or income or wealth? Are there lights on the horizon that look as if they might have real political prospect?
Well, having worked on this for a couple decades, I think that the turning point was, I think the United States has a very high tolerance for inequality. As long as people believe that the rules are fair and anyone can become wealthy and that there's social mobility. But I think after 2008, 2009, the economic meltdown, some of that that attachment, if you will, that story changed, meaning people started to realize that the rules were not the same for everybody and that social mobility was stalling out. And so I think there's been a progressive growing concern about inequality. I think that the conversation obviously changed with the Democrats taking the House because all of a sudden there are proposals on the table, there are hearings, there's a different conversation. But in a way, I think it mirrors the shifting public perspective over the last decade, that these inequalities really are affecting and undermining what we care about. So, I think, we all, I think, here are familiar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, let's restore the top, the 70% income tax upper rate, Senator Sanders' proposal for a progressive estate tax, Senator Warren's proposal for a wealth tax, and a number of other proposals in the pipeline. None of those are going to pass, or obviously with the Senate in the current situation. But the conversation is going to rapidly shift. And actually, I'm part of two conferences this April and in June that are focusing on taxing the top, and what are the various proposals and what are the political possibilities. So that's how you can tell there's sort of some kind of undercurrent, some pivot happening. So I think the whole conversation about inequality in the next 2 years is going to radically shift, and I actually think candidates are going to start to run and win on proposals that will fundamentally reverse some of these extreme inequalities, and that's when we'll see a realignment, a fundamental realignment. And I'm not saying that things can't go badly or go the wrong way, but I think there's a pretty good scenario that might move things in the right direction.
And let me just mention one piece of legislation that will be coming later this spring from Congressman Mark DeSaulnier from California. He's going to propose the first omnibus federal pay ratio bill that is going to tax corporations with CEOs who make many times more than their workers, going to tax them at a higher rate. It's going to deny those corporations, it's going to make it harder for those corporations to get government contracts, and it's going to deny those corporations that overpay their executives compared to their workers, going to not deny those corporations government subsidies.
I'm going to turn us to questions from all of you. Let me just stand here so I can see, although, first of all, Jimmy, our staff person here, has a microphone. Let me ask you the completely standard. Tell us who you are, and please make your question relatively short and don't give us a long statement.
Should I stand? Yeah. My name is Chris. I'm a concerned citizen. I live in New York City. I know this is about solutions, but I wonder if you could back up a step and talk about consequences to lay a premise for the conversation. I used to work for people who would say that this is not a problem to be solved, that a Gini coefficient of 1 is just as fair as a Gini coefficient of 0 as long as everybody's playing the same rules, right? But I wonder if you could get into the practical, not the normative consequences or attitudes toward inequality. There must be reasonable, well, there must be significant economic consequences, and that's what I want you to discuss, of severe levels of inequality.
Yes, 40 years ago, the conventional economic wisdom was that if you had a modern society, a modern market economy, that inequality, inequality was inevitable in that society, and that attempts to knock down that inequality would hurt economic growth and make the entire society economically poorer. But I think now there's a new economic, consensus among economists that inequality is a real danger, that is a real obstacle to stable, growing economies. So that sense has changed over recent years, and there are a number of reasons why economists see inequality as a serious problem now.
Yeah, I would just underscore there is this body of work that extreme inequality is bad for the economy. It creates problems of aggregate demand when workers don't have, wages are stagnant, not participating in the economy, consumption based on growth, that's bad for the economy. And then all the way to what does it do inside companies? How does it undermine morale and health within a company to have extreme pay ratios? So I know Joseph Stiglitz has written about this. And actually there's a New Yorker named Peter Georgescu who's a retired CEO of Rubicam and Young, who wrote an interesting book called Capitalists Arise. Essentially he's making the business case for addressing extreme inequality. And one thing I love, he says, people used to say, oh, if you look and discuss or implement any of Sam's proposal, you will kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And his argument is extreme inequality is killing the goose, and we can't ignore it.
I'm actually going to add a couple sentences, moderator privilege. There is an enormous academic literature now on inequality and growth. It's complicated. Certain forms of inequality are especially problematic for growth. And I think it's really what used to be viewed as kind of a left-wing idea is now an argument that's coming from the World Bank and the IMF and the OECD. That's viewed as really conventional thinking. There's also a lot of research on other instrumental type concerns that inequality is bad for intergenerational mobility, and it's damaging to the democratic process. So there's a lot of discussion now about the negative consequences. Instead of just talking about inequality being bad because it's bad, it's causing other things that are it's not controversial to say that they're bad.
Yeah, so I have a question specifically about things like automation, the rise of machine learning and AI, and how there's major transformations in our workforce, both for blue-collar and white-collar workers, and we're going to have a major disruption with lots of job loss. So I'm wondering, which also contributes a lot to inequality, so I'm wondering about specific solutions that are tied to just workers being replaced by technology. So some examples of that.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a growing recognition we're about to go through kind of another wave of technological change that will displace and eliminate jobs. There's a whole movement, and some of it in part driven by Silicon Valley, that's looking at the whole universal basic income proposal because they understand we're going to have huge amounts of disruption and maybe we should experiment, so they're actually funding these experiments in different parts of the country, looking at what would it take to have a universal basic income. I mean, I would just remind us that technological change is not just a force of nature. We as a society can sort of decide how that works. The promise of technological gain was always that we were going to have more leisure time and that we would spread the work around. And that hasn't seemed to be the case. But what if we focused on shorter work week and a broader focus on distribution of work so that more people could have wage income, maybe alongside of a universal basic income that would maybe have the benefits of changing technology, but would also increase free time and the time to do other things other than work for wages. So I think there are a bunch of folks who are looking at both how do you reduce inequality, offset the impact, almost accepting that the technological change is inevitable, and then there's how do we create boundaries and rules and a sense of common good around how we do transition to new technologies.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Weingarten. I work at Columbia Business School. And I was wondering if there is a presidential candidate that you guys support based on their economic platform.
We're actually going to be working with the Nation magazine this coming year in putting together a survey questionnaire for presidential candidates that looks at different options on inequality, and we'd like to get the candidates on the record on where they stand to help voters make that choice.
You know, and I think one of the things, we're not endorsing anybody, I guess it could be, but what I think I would say is there are questions that you as citizens, voters, want to be thinking about. What is the candidate's story about inequality? Do they attribute it to technological change, or do they understand the power shifts that have come about? Do they talk about only the floor and opportunity, or are they willing to talk about the concentration of wealth and power? And is that part of their understanding of inequality? And then what kind of specific public policies are people putting forward? The good news is we're going to have a very rigorous conversation over the next year about how to address inequality. Both the causes, the drivers, what does it mean, and what to do about it. And so I think we should all just sort of recognize this is the inequality election. There's other issues, but this is going to fundamentally be about how do we reverse these trends, and what candidates have to offer in that area.
When will we see the results of this project you're doing with the Nation, the surveys?
Probably like September. But part of that's, we think that the field will shrink a little bit, so we won't necessarily be focusing on 20 candidates. Maybe we'll be down to 8, and then you can kind of.
Hi, my name's Damon. I'm a former tax attorney. I now do securities regulation. Not on the evil side, though. I do reg change.
Thanks for keeping an eye on things.
Sure. So I think, regarding the gift and estate tax, right, when we're shifting it to actually looking at individuals, part of what we've seen that's been successful with the OECD is their base erosion and profit shifting scheme. They've been able to successfully close quite a lot of international tax loopholes, bring it at least out of the dark, and reduce those structuring efforts and make it a lot harder for people who used to be, like me, to create those kinds of structures that shift the profits. Is it possible that this is a route for individual income, that we look at the loopholes that are going on day in and day out in the Proskauers, the Skaddens of the world, and we close them down, expose them for individuals as well?
Yes, so one context is that the European Union is moving much more quickly toward transparency, country-by-country tax reporting, shutting down the uses of tax havens. Not fast enough, but they're making the United States look like look like laggards when it comes to those policies. So the things that we're looking at, both in terms of corporations, we should also be looking at in terms of individuals. And actually, Gabriel Zuckman, who wrote a really interesting book called The Hidden Wealth of Nations, he estimates that 10% of the world's wealth is now hidden. Wealth of the very wealthy. Where is it? Well, it's in offshore corporations. It's in trusts that mask who the owners are. It's in the sort of global corporate shell game. It's in the residential luxury tower right over here. The money isn't necessarily in the Cayman Islands. It's actually here in New York, but its ownership is masked through a shell corporation. So there's a lot we can do around individuals and requiring disclosure of beneficial ownership, cracking down. The United States could play a critical role in cracking down and creating treaties between other countries requiring greater transparency, shutting down offshore tax havens. So I think both looking at the corporate side and the individuals. And part of it is actually looking at what you could call the wealth protection industry, or the dynasty protection racket, or whatever you want to call it. You know, we have, you know, the traditional process, or whatever, the idea that wealth is grows and goes from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, right? You know, so one family grows the wealth, and then, you know, and it sort of disperses theoretically because people have children. They give some to, they pay their taxes, they give to charity, the money disperses over time. The reality is we're seeing the opposite. Families have figured out how to arrest the development and expand dynasties over time. So the 3 biggest wealth dynasties, the Waltons of Walmart, the Kochs, the Koch brothers, and the Mars family candy dynasty, since 1983 has seen their wealth increase almost 6,000%. Thanks to, and this is the wealth we know about. This is the wealth that's on the books. So I think in fact, we're going to have a hard time implementing some of the proposals we're talking about with the amount of escape hatches that now exist that allow people to hide wealth.
One more question. Who's the lucky person with the microphone?
Hello, my name is John Stout. I'm retired. Are there any statistics on economic inequality in China? Has it grown since the 1980s, and is the communist regime doing anything about it?
China is an interesting story. If you look at the globe has actually, the global population has actually become a little less unequal because of China, essentially, because average people in China are making much more than they used to make. But the rich in China are making fantastically more than they used to make. So actual income inequality within China has increased over the last generation. And what we seem to be seeing now is that increases at the bottom of Chinese society, that great surge that China realized over the past generation is slowing down. And China is more and more displaying the characteristics of advanced economies like the United States, where inequality is widening and incomes for people at the base are stagnating.
I'll make a quick publicity for our colleague Branko Milanovic, who's not here, the 6th member of the Stone Center faculty, has done a lot of research on rising inequality in China. Indeed, as Sam said, the bottom has come up a lot, the top is coming up. You know, the data are not, they can be problematic, but the trend is clear. Same thing in Russia, I might add, enormously rising inequality after the end of the Soviet period. Milanovic has a new book coming out this year called Capitalism Alone, which will be a close look at Chinese capitalism with a focus on rising inequality. And on that note, it is my sad duty to bring us to a close because we need to keep us on schedule so that you all get a chance to buy some books and to have some wine and to talk with one another. So thank you so much for coming.